What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the Cutlass Board Games channel. I'm Keith and I make games for a living, and that's why I want to talk to you about designing game experiences with joy in mind. You might be in your fifth game of your losing streak on League of Legends, pulling your hair out, wondering why this thing that was supposed to be fun is such a terrible time. You might be playing Magic the Gathering and everyone is bullying you and everything is going wrong. I want to talk about why we should be focusing on creating joy in these experiences, things that were already supposed to be fun, things that were supposed to bring joy. And for those game designers in the audience, how you can think about using this when you are creating games to kind of ensure that players are going to have a good time. So let's get started. Let's talk about it. You are challenged. You have been given a box filled with joy. How do you evenly distribute the joy amongst all of the players? This is how I think about designing a game. So let's automatically assume that the game is fun, but throughout actions of the game, fun is deducted or removed or unevenly distributed. One of the main complaints about Blood on the Clocktower is people say that the storyteller has the most fun pretty consistently amongst every game. So the joy has been distributed unevenly. How do you best distribute the joy is kind of the problem, and is kind of the thing that a lot of gaming needs to look at. In a lot of competitive games, there is a winner who has all the fun and a loser who arguably has less fun. Is there ways to create games where losing still creates as much joy because you participated or because something cool happened and you got to tell a story about it? Well, that's what we're going to be diving into here today. I'm going to give you 3 games and I'm going to levy off some examples, use them as a little bit of a framework, and then kind of talk about the theory of joy exchange in general to help get you an idea of what we're dealing with here. Game number 1, Magic the Gathering. Specifically Commander, because it's such a more accessible point, but Commander has a greater parallel with other game design theory because it is multiplayer. In 2-player, it's like I'm defeating you and I am accruing the joy for myself, which arguably is some of the criticism against this competitive gaming in general. But I want to talk about how you can be encouraging joyous experiences in multiplayer formats. It doesn't need to be about whether or not there is a winner. Sometimes you have goals beyond victory. You want that cool thing to happen. You want your favorite guy to get time to be showcased. This is all stuff that you need to be considering when playing the game. Game number 2, Blood on the Clocktower. No shit, we talk about this game a lot on the channel, and I think it is kind of like really earned that mention. I know it'll be an easy touchstone for a lot of people that follow this channel because we play it here all the time. But also, Clocktower is a great example simply because it exists from looking at Werewolf and seeing some of the negative joy exchange in that game and adding more purpose to some of it. One of the major changes is that in Werewolf, once you die, you can no longer talk. You were pretty much politely asked to leave. In Clocktower, you are still there and able to try and solve the puzzle and contribute to help your team win, which is looking at a negative joy exchange problem and encouraging ways to make it more fun for more players. Check. Big success. We're going to be digging into that a little bit as well. And I want to talk about Pandemic. We're going to be talking about how fully cooperative, cooperative victory conditions and stuff like that can be different and give you new and different opportunities for how joy exchange works. But I have been using this phrase, joy exchange, a lot. And I think that there is a perfect comic that can help explain exactly how this works. This is a comic by Shen. It kind of like blew up as a meme and people were really making fun of it, but it actually really does explain exactly how joy exchange works. He says, my bike got stolen recently and I was pretty bummed about it, but I think whoever stole it was probably more happy to get it than I am sad to lose it. The total happiness in the world increased, so whatever. And that's pretty much how it works, except there's a lot of other different levers that can be pulled for this. And not all joy exchange is created equal. You can be gaining more than somebody else is losing, and the idea is to have the total happiness in the world increase. He gets the purpose correct. So let me introduce you to two of my friends. This is Abigail and Jonas. Their names are very important. There will in fact be a quiz later. Now, here I have precariously placed my head in the way of the graph. Here, Abigail has done something that has created her a little bit of joy. You can see on this little graph, the red line is everyone's kind of base level of joy, and she has done something. You can see that she's laughing and very happy, but realistically, it's only created a small amount of joy. Look at that big empty meter. There's so much more space for fun things we could put in there. Now look at Jonas. He's dying inside. He is contemplating death, and you can see his joy meter is depleted. It's almost completely at the bottom. And so is this fun? Is this something you want to be encouraging? Probably not, because the amount of joy created far underweighs the amount of sadness, disappointment, struggle created, and so it doesn't encourage a fun experience. And a lot of games have these aspects to them, and sometimes players with a great appetite for chaos, a thing that I'll talk about later, a great appetite for chaos, will try out these things. Every other player will suffer, and that person gets to go, hee hee, I'm a funny goblin. But then ultimately, it really wasn't that fun and exciting. And then the slow drag on afterwards wasn't really much worth it. Joy is not equally given and lost. That means more can be created than started in the box, but more can be lost than was started with. Very uncommon to be able to use torpedo an entire vibe and ruin it for everybody, but it's still kind of a challenge to kind of create more than what the base experience of a game creates. If you are creating a game, then it's your goal is to create rules that encourage people to take actions that create more joy. A personal friend of mine and hero, Peter C. Haywood, once said that given the situation, if you ask players to have fun, they will say no. And you have to do things that trick them into having fun. You have to do things that silently encourage them to want to be doing it already. You have to incept your players into making fun choices. So I'm going to give you an example. Our friends, Abigail and Jonas, have made two new friends. This is Lindsay and Graham. Their names are not important and will not be on the quest later. So, they are all playing Magic the Gathering. As you can see, they're having a great time. As always, Abigail is smiling and laughing, and that's because in her hand she is about to cast Armageddon. And Armageddon, a thing that she thinks is going to be very fun and interesting at the time, but every other person is going to suffer with. And I want to kind of talk about what a negative joy exchange looks like, because when people talk about formats like Commander, and you can see how the bracket systems are arranged, things at the lower ends create negative joy exchange, and you can see why they're kind of politely asked not to be included. We're talking about mass land denial, we're talking about chaining infinite turns, we're talking about infinite combos that end the game instantly. And kind of let's quickly talk about why those things are problems. But mass land denial basically removes players' abilities to interact and play the game. It can potentially lock out an entire player, and like we talked about earlier with the werewolf problem, spectating a game that you were supposed to be playing sucks big time. Chaining infinite turns is basically saying I'm going to be having the rest of the turns of the game, you do not get to play. Same problem. But then the kind of infinite combo that unexpectedly ends the game reduces players' ability to interact and kind of stop a thing that is coming. They don't have a big enough window to kind of prevent such a thing. So it removes their ability to interact and removes their ability to contribute to what is happening in the game, which is kind of what I want to get into here. A negative joy exchange sounds like removing a player's ability to play the game. I know my slides are unreadable because I'm a bit large. I'm sorry about that. It also looks like removing a player's ability to control game outcomes. So it's a bit. So the first one is more general. So it's like if you're just removed completely, you aren't able to play the game at all, or if you have no ability to interact, or like for example, if your lands are destroyed, you can't cast any spells or anything, you're not really playing the game. Whereas the second one, removing a player's ability to control game outcomes, might be that you are in the game, but you can't stop yourself from winning or losing. You can't stop bad things from continuing happening to you. You have just kind of no player agency at all when it comes to that, and that creates a negative joy exchange. Negatively affecting a player for no visible goal of your own. This is one that we kind of see a lot with the appetite for chaos problem, where people are like, oh, I want to do this thing, it's going to be really funny. And then in the moment when they do it, it sucks big time, and it's actually not very funny. And you don't actually have a funny story to tell about it later. It's just like this terrible thing happened, and I thought it would be great. And it wasn't, which is kind of, it is a bit like that. And the last one is removing an object that created joy. Sometimes you hear about this in Dungeons and Dragons campaigns when like a really beloved character dies, or a newer player who was like really attached to their first guy that they made, had miniatures made for them, an art commission, all that kind of stuff, and they die really early. That thing and that promised potential of what that thing could have been has been removed, and therefore its ability to create joy as a game piece has been taken from you, which is a negative joy exchange. Now, let's talk about Blood on the Clocktower. Now, the reason why there was no quiz is because all their names are up on the screen. We have our 4 besties. They are playing Blood on the Clocktower. Now, I kind of want to talk about specifically how Clocktower deals with joy exchanges, because some of the things that I just listed, you could argue that there are existing characters that do make that kind of difficult. You could argue that if somebody is Cerenovus locked for the entire game and they couldn't actually say what their real townsfolk character was, their ability to contribute to the game is diminished, and that could be a negative joy exchange, which I would argue is an interpretation, but I'll disagree and I'll get into that in a little bit. And there's a few other characters that you could kind of say have that same problem. Now, let's talk about Clocktower more generally, because each team has a clear end state. You know what it looks like when the evil team wins, and you know what it looks like when the good team wins. And ideally, that happens towards the end of the game, because the game is kind of naturally moving towards a conclusion, whether or not the players actively participate in that. Because of executions or because of the demon killing people, players will naturally be eliminated, and the game will kind of naturally end regardless of whether people are actively moving towards that end state. Now, the evil team sets up obstacles that create opportunity for joy in creating a puzzle to solve. The Cerenovus locking a player requires that Cerenovus to be alive for the entire game. If it suddenly stops, that player who was Cerenovus mad the entire game gets a powerful piece of information about the puzzle. They can also are now free to give all the information of their actual character and kind of dispel some of the previous nonsense that have been happening so far. It's creating an obstacle. And likewise, the player who has been Cerelocked could make that risk and break madness and actually just give all the information if the consequence isn't so dire, which I think sometimes is worth considering. Now, the second part. The good team tries to collaboratively solve the puzzle without compromising it. This is where I see a lot of the problems come together. You can see good players throwing each other bars. I'm also sometimes guilty of this, like doing something really crazy on the first day or advocating for somebody's execution without actually having really good cause to do so. I do this all the time to one of our players, Kate. It's kind of a silly running gag at the moment where I will come into the town square. I will pretend that she has said all these crazy things to me and then advocate for her execution. Or I'll come up with a crazy plan that just requires her dying for the plan to work. And that's funny for me, and part of that is me doing it for YouTube, because for the unseen third audience, a thing that doesn't exist when you're worrying about like natural game state, can potentially receive joy from this, and so I'm stealing from us and giving to them. Like likewise, if I'm having a really fucking bad time playing Blood on the Clocktower, everything's going horribly, and I'm suffering, that can potentially create an enjoyable experience for a spectator, watching the video, and so I'm happy to suffer through it a little bit. But that's not a thing that you should be considering in the moment while you're playing the game. You're not always a gladiator in the arena when you're begging for the thumbs up. Sometimes you are just trying to have a good time in the moment that you're having, which is the thing that we're focusing on in this video. So let's talk about how that kind of falls apart, because ultimately the game is ruined if an evil player reveals the puzzle. This sometimes happens with a traveler, a good traveler, going up to a player and saying, I know you're the demon, tell me everything. They admit to being the demon, and then the good traveler's like, haha, got you. I had no idea because I'm actually on the good team. Let's execute that guy that they admitted to being the demon. Many times when I have seen this happen, that traveler player, because they're not a full player, they're not fully committed to the game, they could just leave at any time, often will forget that or cede that to allow the game to continue and for other players to have fun, which kind of is telling that that is not a thing that is supposed to kind of naturally happen as part of the game. The same is the magician can also accidentally create this state, because the magician is supposed to create awareness and a difficulty for the evil team to communicate with each other. The magician is not there for a good player to just get a gotcha on the demon and then to solve the game on the first day because the demon said, hello, yes, I am the demon, these are the demon bluffs, that's my other minion. Right? So if the puzzle is revealed, it becomes a non-game. There's no puzzle to solve. There's no discourse about how it's being played. That removes the potential joy that could have been had from all of the players. But then on the opposite end, the game is compromised if a good player refuses to attempt to solve the puzzle. This usually happens because something bad has happened to them previously. Something, usually in the form of another player's negative action, sometimes because of something that's happened, like the storyteller's made a really poor choice, and that player's upset, and they're kind of like, it's fine, just execute me, and then they just kind of refuse to contribute to the rest of the game. This can just happen. It's happened to me. There's been times when I've done this, and it's kind of that mindset of, this one is bad, I'm just waiting for it to end, and then hopefully the next one will be good. And it's kind of really hard to salvage from that situation. And unfortunately, Clocktower doesn't really require every player to be playing all of the time for it to kind of work. But sometimes, if you really are that crucial player that has all the information or whatever, and you kind of remove yourself, you are sabotaging other players' ability to play the game. And also just being like stroppy and grumpy doesn't really make for a fun time for anyone. But I want to talk about the appetite for chaos. This is where I think most of the problem comes from, and a lot of people don't really understand. So the main way negative joy exchange is created in the game is when players yearn for chaos beyond the balance, and the wizard is the number one culprit for this. The number two culprit is script building, which we'll get into in a second. But basically, the wizard is an unbalanceable character because the storyteller can't really set up a grimoire that understands how powerful the wizard could be. Like, we've had wizard wishes on the channel that have just done nothing. Like, they've just been so needle specific that circumstance never came about, and so it accomplished nothing. But also, we've had wizard wishes that have just completely shut down the good team from playing the game, and then just allowed any evil player that sounded slightly confident about what was going on to just run the entire game. I had a game where my wizard was sitting next to me, and he told me what the wizard wish, so I knew it was, like, kind of in advance, and I could play along, where every second townsfolk was drunk, and every other townsfolk acted twice. I claimed, not in the bluffs, the Dreamer, a character that was in play already, and I knew this, because I think I had this, the spy gave me the entire grimoire as well, because we were in a lot of Typhon line. And then as my fake Dreamer information, I correctly called out a whole bunch of people's roles, and also I was claiming to have acted twice, which some people were saying the wizard had affected them to do. Whereas the real Dreamer, air quotes, real Dreamer, was poisoned the entire time because he just happened to be, sitting in a spot that did not act twice. And so he's like, yeah, man, I don't know what's going on. All my Dreamer information is crap. All your Dreamer information is pretty good. and also you're acting twice. So maybe you're getting something that I'm not. You're able to contribute to the puzzle better than I can. I kind of have to trust that you know what's going on because I don't. And that's really brutal. And I think on the end of Wizard Wishes, that's not even some of the craziest ones that we've seen. So the Wizard is a really, really hard character because what people think in their heads is a fun Wizard Wish is not an additional challenge to solve the puzzle. What people in their heads think is a great Wizard Wish is just something that fucks everything up, and the game becomes unrecognizable and impossible to solve, to recognize as Blood on the Clocktower. And that's kind of the problem with it. And like, there's a lot of other situations, like the Wizard is not the only culprit of this, is what I'm trying to say. But oftentimes you will get a Wizard Wish where something will happen and then the players can instantly recognize that that is fundamentally broken or like removes the good team's ability to do anything. And that's kind of brutal. And because it's so open-ended, the reason why a clock tower is a fun puzzle to solve is because there is a finite number of outcomes, and the way that you solve the puzzle is with information that you get from different townsfolk. You are able to eliminate certain outcomes and create a worldview of what you think the possible amount of outcomes was that is equal to what the grimoire setup is. The wizard adds an infinite number of outcomes that cannot be shrunk down, and part of it is you must communicate like over clearly about what this thing is. But let's say the Amnesiac is the same, right? How often, and like even in games like No Rolls Barred, where it's these people fucking job to play the game on camera for people, and we're getting the Amnesiac not even close to guessing what their ability is towards the end of the game. And it's like, the job of the character is to create a puzzle for you to figure out what your information is, but sometimes that's just impossible, and then therefore it's not a helpful character. We saw that in the World Cup scripts competition, where people were one of them was submitted was that just literally the Amnesiac is an outsider and you're trying to figure out what your detrimental ability is, because that's what it feels like, and players are communicating that this is a negative outcome character when it's supposed to be a townsfolk, a powerful info character, because storytellers aren't communicating enough. Storytellers aren't giving that ability to solve the game to that player, which is why it feels like a negative experience. Which leads into my next point. The storyteller's job is to maintain the balance of joy between the teams. The closer to even, the more exciting the final outcome. The being right on the edge of having the puzzle solved, right up until the final day, is the most exciting, best Clock Tower game. You want to get to the Grim reveal and be confident that you made the right choices, but uncertain of the outcome, right? You want to get to the end and be like, I'm really sure it was that guy, but I know that there is a margin for error. I know something that could have gone wrong. I know something could have happened. I know I'm missing something that could, this fuckery about, that could make me incorrect. And that's part of the fun of it. Is like getting to the end of it, be like, I knew it. I was right. I figured it out. I'm so smart. I figured it out. Is that thing that they are trying to create. If that doesn't happen, if you get to the end, you go, this is fucking unsolvable. That's not a fun game. That's not Blood on the Clock Tower. That's not a puzzle to solve. That is a unbalanced joy exchange between the teams. You need to facilitate the Evil's team's ability to kind of, obstruct the puzzle and have that being a silly goblin kind of a moment. But then also you need to give the good team equal amount of opportunities to solve that puzzle. And there are a lot of characters that make that a lot harder to accomplish. And so perhaps you need to be a bit more wary of those things when you are running the game. Run a bit more caution with it. Maybe be a bit more forgiving to the good team at times. Maybe just give some hints. Just fucking outright tell people some things sometimes, because sometimes they need the help. And Magic the Gathering is similar, except instead of thinking about what characters are on the script, you need to think about what cards are in your deck. Archidekt, a website that I used to track all of my deck lists, has a feature where each of the cards has a salt rating, where basically if people overwhelmingly hate a card, it's going to have a high salt rating. And sometimes because the entire community includes everyone in every bracket, from like the most beginner bracket 1 player to the most advanced CEDH players, they're going to have differing opinions. So obviously it's not super duper accurate. For example, Tropical Island has a higher salt score than Tundra. I can't reconcile that personally, but it is important when setting up to play to consider, are there cards in my deck that don't bring me that much joy but will rob other people of joy? I made a video recently about Brawl in the 1v1 format with cards like Strip Mine. Strip Mine frustrates me to no end because Wasteland exists, and Wasteland is a more forgiving version of Strip Mine, but Wasteland exists with a purpose, right? Wasteland says, I can deal with this problematic non-basic land, a thing that sometimes needs to happen, because stuff like Gaia's Cradle, stuff like Evander Waking Haven exists, and sometimes you need to deal with that to stop your opponent from rocketing ahead. I understand that, and that is Wasteland's job. Strip Mine's job is to remove your opponent's ability from playing the game, which is unfun, which I logged into Magic Arena to play the game. Having my ability to play the game removed from me is not fun. And so think about that in the same way in Commander. Strip Mine is obviously much less backbreaking, but there is just way fewer scenarios where you're going to need to be able to remove a basic land versus a non-basic land. Basic land are pretty uniform in what they do, unless if it specifically has like a powerful enchantment attached to it, is really the only scenario I can think of. Then just play enchantment removal. You don't ever realistically need Strip Mine over Wasteland, and that's part of my main kind of critique with some of this stuff. And we mentioned Armageddon before. In the same way, like, would you ever need to cast Armageddon to deal with a land that has a chain to the rocks on it? I don't really think that's an appropriate solution to a task. For me, the joy is, cool, I get my guy back that was chained to the rocks. But for everyone else, they're like, well, I don't get to play the game because my ability to take game actions has been removed for me. And thinking about those kinds of joy exchanges are really important. Even if you're playing in like 3, 4, 5 CEDH, there's the politics of the game are there to try and enforce you from unfairly taking advantage of one player. And then most of the ban list is kind of around you rocketing in front of everyone, right? So there's nothing in the ban list that stops you from stopping one player from playing the game, which is really interesting to me. And like, that's kind of fine. And like sometimes the solution is don't do that. And a lot of their argument for how they maintain the ban list is that it's hard for you to get away with being an arsehole because there's 3 other people there to be like, don't do that. But that isn't the truth of every board game table, and that also implies that every single person at the table is able to contribute meaningfully to that kind of contract of how we play the game. Like, if I go, hey, don't be an arsehole, then am I being the bad guy because I'm overstepping a boundary or whatever? There are other people that need the ability to say, hey, don't be an arsehole, but don't feel like they can speak up because they're not on the same social standing or whatever. Difficulties with that kind of thing. Like a lot of this opportunity for mayhem to happen relies on players to police it verbally or through stuff like that, does make it really hard to rely on the players to curate a good experience, because like we said before, if you instruct the players to have fun, often they will say no, and that's kind of the problem, right? So rather than, hey, I'm going to do this thing, you need to look at how can I create challenges rather than like that. So I really like a card called Chains of Mephistopheles. It's really backbreaking if your strategy is to rocket ahead in card advantage and draw way more cards than me. And I think slowing your ability to do that, where you have to discard most of those cards that you would draw, but then you're not completely locked out of drawing extra cards, like say Spirit of the Labyrinth, which just says you cannot. Instead, you discard a bunch of them. So like, you could just choose not to draw them, or you can draw them at a cost. It creates an obstacle, and so I think that is really fun. But also, I might get upside because I want to discard cards, or I want cards in my graveyard, and so when I'm activating my own Chains of Mephistopheles, I'm getting advantage from that. So its joy exchange is really interesting. Every single time I've played on the table, every single other player is going, yo, fuck that thing. We're getting rid of that immediately. You are the arch enemy. We all hate you. And I'm like, I'm playing a 2 and you're playing a 5. and this is my only chance at keeping up with you, but you've all decided that I'm the bad guy here, is really interesting to me as like a case scenario. And there's going to be lots of cards that do stuff like that. Sometimes innocently, sometimes you're like, well, I thought it was just dealing with a specific problem instead of gaining a huge amount of advantage. And the ban list is supposed to kind of maintain and communicate that. But on the Clock Tower, it doesn't really have any scenarios where it's like, hey, look, this character, don't act like this when you play it or whatever. But it does have a jinx system which prevents characters from potentially doing nothing or interacting in a problematic way. Like we've seen recently with the Alchemist and like the Spy and the Widow, where instead of just not being able to see the Grimoire, thing that a townsfolk really shouldn't do, then instead they have the ability to rob the minion of their ability and in forcing the demon to kill them, a thing which has great value for the good team. So there is interesting ways to police and remove players to have the ability to create negative experiences for players. With Commander, we've got the ban list. With Clock Tower, we've got stuff like jinxes. But also, when you are building a script, it's important to pay attention to what characters you have. So, like it says on the page, when building a script or a rack up for a game, consider, are there characters here that remove another character's ability to function? This is just at the most basic level. Is this thing a problem? Will this thing work? What kind of issues could this create? And sometimes it's a little bit more obvious than that, but on screen I've given the example of the Summoner and the Princess. We had a game recently where one of our players was the Princess, and they looked at the script and they go, well, I'm pretty confident that this is the kind of script where you would play a Summoner, and the Summoner means that there's no demon in play for the Princess to prevent from activating, so I'm not going to do anything. Regardless of any information of what actually was in the Grimoire, they decided that their ability was not going to function and were having a bad time. And there's, especially historically, been many kind of scenarios like that where not even in play, not even someone claiming something, but a character on the script gives a player the ability to bluff something, and regardless of how that interacts, that means that people will act as if that thing is in play and act accordingly. So having a character say that if you do something, something will happen, and that thing happening, regardless of whether you are that character, is going to, kind of contribute to that game state. And I am really tiptoeing around a specific two-character problem that I've had with characters that aren't released. But this is a pretty good example of such a thing. And way back in the day, there was not jinxes, there was clashes, and clashes meant these two characters can't be on the same script together because they do not function. And then none of them exist anymore. Pretty much any character that had unresolved or unresolvable clashes did not get released. And then jinxes are like, okay, this does work, but maybe these two characters can't be in play at the same time, or if they are in play, this is how they should function. And it's slowly been watered down over time, where jinxes have been like a storyteller's suggestion for how a thing should be resolved, but like ultimately they've always been like, I'll do whatever you want. And that sort of is kind of the same function as a ban list in something like Commander, where you are trying to figure out exactly what is good for the experience you are signing up to have. And Clock Tower in the same way, when you look at the script, some people are like, I don't want to play a specific script because their experiences have been negative because of particular characters or because of particular interactions or a particular playstyle that doesn't match what they want to do. We have some players in our regular group that really hate Trouble Brewing. We have some players in our regular group that really hate Babylon Rising, but then we have others that really enjoy it. And so it's kind of difficult to recognize exactly what the issue is that is creating here. But oftentimes, that means that they are recognizing that regardless of the circumstances of a specific game, I am confident that this script is going to create a negative experience for me, even though other people might enjoy it. And that is usually indicative that something needs to change. And oftentimes playtesters, for us designers out there, oftentimes playtesters will suggest falsely, like, this thing needs to be fixed, because that's how they think the advice should be. When instead they're like, I hated this thing, or this thing really sucked, is like a way better way to communicate what that problem is and to kind of get you on the path for solving it. So let's talk about some tips for designers. When designing a game, consider, does the game encourage players towards a climax? towards a natural climax. Like Clock Tower, I said before, is a really good example because players are slowly kind of being eliminated from contention for being the demon, and people will naturally come to a conclusion as to the solution of the puzzle. Commander is one of these that has a problem with that, where Magic the Gathering doesn't have a natural end state that players will arrive at in an appropriate time. If every player draws every card in their deck because there was 99 turns, the game will end. But it's not really a thing that happens, and the game isn't rocketing towards that outcome. Pokemon TCG is a game that is much more like that, where the game is rocketing towards that outcome because you're drawing so many cards in a turn, and some decks are like, look, if I just slow you down at the right moment, if I prevent you from being able to take prize cards, or I lock you in a specific configuration, you will sit here and grind through the rest of your resources, and that's how I will win. And it's a legitimate outcome. Magic the Gathering doesn't really have that in the same way. You can't sit here and take 60 turns and draw your entire deck like that in a way that Pokemon TCG can. Now, having games like Clock Tower that move towards a climax, I have a game, Spaceship Redoubt, where you get 6 turns and the game explodes and you stop playing, and then it assesses the win conditions of like each different team, and goes, well, this is the outcome, and you go, well, I'm on the team that won, that's great for me. And I think more games should do that, where it's like, I understand I'm either against a clock or I'm a timer of some kind, and the game will naturally end, and I must do my thing before that happens, can prevent this problem that Magic has, where in a Commander game, you need to find a way to end it somehow. Otherwise, you can kind of run on forever. And if you didn't build a deck that kind of ends things efficiently, or your game plan is getting solved a little bit too easily, you can't end the game. I have this problem because I like Craterhoof Behemoth because it's like a really telegraphed finisher. Like if I have a lot of guys in play, Craterhoof ends the game. And so if I get board wiped a bunch of times and I just have no guys in play, Craterhoof doesn't do anything, and so it's really hard to close out the game like this. Next point. How much control do players need over their own outcomes? So the use of a storyteller is really interesting in this because the players don't often have much control over their own outcomes. For example, the poisoner selects a player, that player is poisoned. Their information is up to the storyteller. If they're a player that says, I choose a player and I learn if they are the demon, yes, no. And then the storyteller goes, well, I can tell them whatever I want because they are poisoned. I can tell them the wrong thing, I can tell them the right thing based on how tough time the good team is having, because that player still must trust their own information and still must rally the good team around that solution to solve the game, right? And so in Clock Tower, the answer is players do not need a lot of control over their own outcomes, but need a lot of control over their own agency. You need to feel like you're picking targets, or you're calling to execute plays that are relevant. You need to have that ability to move the game towards what you think the solved position is. But the storyteller does a lot to help guide you to that and try and pull it back or push it up so that it is as even as possible the whole time, which is very difficult. Now, the next one, how much opportunity do players need to interact to keep it competitive? In Commander, sometimes you are looking for cards that deal with multiple problems at once, like a big board wipe, or there's like a lot of good cards that will like destroy 2 things or bounce 2 things or like deal with a couple of things at a time. And it's like, how many times do you need to really do this? And the thing says that you should be playing more threats than removal most of the time in Commander. Whereas if you play more of a control archetype, you should just like 1 or 2 big things, and you're like trying to slow the game down until they do come down and end the game. But for the most part, you're just kind of throwing out a bunch of cool stuff and then dealing with things that threaten to end the game before the agreed upon conclusion of everyone's tired and wants to go home. However, my favorite type of board game is actually really low interactive. I'm talking Harmonies, I'm talking Azul, I'm talking Sagrada, drafting games where you're just trying to get your best thing out of the pool, and the way the other player interacts with you is by potentially taking the thing that you wanted, rather than like you skip a turn or you explode or your head falls off. It's kind of minor, like they're just taking resources from the same pool, and it just might happen to be the ones that I wanted. Now, these are really good because I can like laser-like focus on myself and how important things are to me and prioritize my objectives and look at my route to victory, which I enjoy. And it also has the least worst games. I will talk a little bit about the least worst games in a second, because that's how I talk about Trouble Brewing. But let's move on to our last point, which is, does interaction simply prolong the climax instead of build to one? This is a problem I see in a lot of games. I see it in a lot of prototypes of games when people play testing stuff, and they recognize that a person in the lead will continue to win unless if another player is able to solve that problem. And like Swords of Catan is a great example of this, where it's like the person who got to place their stuff first is probably in the best place and has the access to the best resources. And then the only way that the other players can potentially catch up is by trading with each other. Or are you just going to be constantly dragging people back to where you are by like something like kill the leader or whatever? Commander can do this a lot, where it's like, well, if I wrath the board, all my shit blows up as well. But this other guy who had a better board state than me is, kind of returned to dust like I am, and that does not build towards a climax. It simply prolongs the end of the game. And so having something that actually still helps you naturally move towards the end of the game is important, and having interaction at those kinds of points I think are really interesting. And that's kind of what I want to be looking at here. And then let's return to title card for a second, because I want to talk about Trouble Brewing, which I have said many times has the least worst experiences. And that is not necessarily because it is deeply playtested. That is not necessarily because of any number of things. It's just basically what the puzzle does is so much easier for a player to conceptualize. The demon, there's one of them. There's really only two major minions that create problems. The first one is the poisoner, and so you maybe don't trust your information. The second one is a Scarlet Woman, so you might have to kill the demon a second time and find out where they have moved to. All of the townsfolk information does a really good job of helping you narrow down potential circumstances for how the game can be set up, and like looking at what the theoretical outcomes and options are. So it is much easier to build a worldview and then try and convince other players of what actually happened in the game. The more complexity, the more characters, the more range of outcomes, the harder this happens, regardless of what team that you're on. It just becomes more difficult for a player in the game to come to a conclusion as to what the setup state is. And that means that the puzzle is bigger than you can conceptualize, and that means that it's harder to solve the game, and it's harder to participate in the puzzle, which is the fun part of the game. And so that's why Trouble Brewing is the best script, and that's why possibly the Wizard is the worst character. I'd probably argue the Amnesiac is worse, but they both have the same problem. They create too many outcomes. Now, I know that this video felt a little bit like a ramble, but it is something that I have been thinking about a lot, and it's a thing that I notice a lot of people don't think about when they interact with stuff. A lot of the time, people will be like, haha, I'm going to do this thing. I know it will be negative for other people, but it will be funny. And it's like, if you know it will be negative for them, will they think it is funny? And we've talked about this. We did the 3 types of fun, where it's like it's fun now and it's fun later when I'm telling stories about it, or it's not fun now and we get to laugh about it later. And I think a lot of people think that some Clock Tower experiences, or even Magic the Gathering experiences, like what if I did this ridiculously? What if I Blood Mooned everyone and no one's playing red? They think that these experiences will be funny later, but then they're not. That's the 4th type of fun. They're accidentally just not fun, actually. It's not fun now and it's not fun later, like League of Legends. And that's kind of the problem that people encounter, where people talk a lot about like threat assessment and assessing things that you actually have to interact with the game and assessing all that kind of stuff. What about we just fucking talk about fun assessment, talk about joy assessment, look at, is this going to actually create fun for people, or is everyone just going to fucking hate that I've done this? And that's the problem with Chains of Mephistopheles. I think it is a very balanced solution to a problem. It removes a lot of joy from a lot of people, despite it not being a hard removal of a resource. It's just a small filtered version of it, but people hate it very much. And because people hate it very much, I need to recognize that it creates a negative joy experience for them, and I need to stop thrusting it upon them. That is part of the essence of this. That is, I don't know, hopefully helping communicate you something, because when it comes to playing Commander, ultimately joy is the goal. Why are you playing a game if misery is the goal? Again, uninstall League of Legends and think about what creating or curating a game experience with joy in mind will be like.